The poor maid's toddler found the mafia boss tied up. What happened next left everyone speechless. What could possibly happen after such an unexpected discovery? Why would a single moment leave everyone speechless? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy powerful stories filled with suspense, emotion, and unforgettable moments, you're in the right place. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories. Your support means the world to us, and we're truly grateful to have you here with us on every new journey. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think you would do if you unexpectedly found someone in a situation like the one described in today's title? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, let's step into today's remarkable story. Some people spend their entire lives searching for a hero, only to discover that true courage sometimes arrives in the smallest pair of footsteps. The old warehouse sat abandoned on the edge of Newark's industrial district, its cracked brick walls swallowing the pale light of an overcast Saturday morning. Broken windows rattled gently whenever the autumn wind slipped through the empty steel frames, carrying the scent of rain and rust across forgotten loading docks that had not welcomed honest work in years. 3-year-old Noah Williams knew nothing about abandoned buildings or dangerous neighborhoods. He only knew that the orange tabby cat he'd been chasing from the nearby playground had disappeared through a narrow opening beneath a crooked chain-link fence. With the fearless curiosity only a toddler could possess, Noah squeezed through the gap, his tiny sneakers crunching over scattered gravel while his favorite stuffed rabbit dragged behind him by one floppy ear. Every few steps he giggled as the cat's tail flashed briefly around another corner before disappearing again. His mother, Grace Williams, had looked away for only a moment while folding the family's worn picnic blanket beside a public bench less than half a block away. She worked 6 days every week cleaning luxury apartments in Manhattan, and Saturdays belonged entirely to Noah whenever she could afford the bus fare. Those precious hours together meant more than sleep, more than comfort, more than almost anything else in her difficult life. When she looked back and saw the empty sidewalk where Noah had been chasing pigeons only seconds earlier, her heart skipped so violently she could barely breathe. She called his name once, then twice, forcing herself to stay calm even as panic crept into every corner of her mind. Meanwhile, Noah wandered deeper into the silent warehouse, following soft paw prints across dusty concrete floors. The cat had vanished again, but something else caught his attention. At the center of the enormous room sat a man in an expensive dark suit, secured to an old wooden chair with thick ropes wrapped around his wrists and chest. His clothes were wrinkled, his face showed clear signs of exhaustion, and his expensive watch reflected the gray daylight pouring through the broken roof above. The stranger slowly lifted his head, expecting another threat, another cruel voice, another endless hour alone. Instead, he found himself staring into the wide brown eyes of a little boy who couldn't have been older than 3. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Then Noah tilted his head with innocent concern, hugged his stuffed rabbit tighter, and asked in the gentlest voice imaginable, "Mister, does it hurt?" The question landed with a force no intimidation, negotiation, or display of power had ever carried. Lorenzo DeLuca, the man whose name made powerful people lower their voices across New York, suddenly found himself unable to answer the simplest question he had ever been asked. Grace heard the faint echo before she saw the broken fence. It was not Noah crying. It was laughter, the bright, carefree laugh that always meant her little boy believed the world was still a safe place. She rushed across the cracked pavement, calling his name again, her voice trembling despite every effort to remain calm. As she slipped through the narrow opening beneath the fence, the abandoned warehouse swallowed the sounds of the city behind her. Every instinct told her to grab Noah and leave immediately, but then, she saw him standing only a few feet away, looking up at the stranger tied to the chair as if he had simply met another lonely person at the park. Grace froze. The man's face was impossible to mistake. She had seen it countless times on television screens mounted inside luxury apartments while she polished marble countertops and dusted priceless artwork. Newspapers had called Lorenzo DeLuca one of the most influential businessmen in New York, while whispers among building staff suggested his influence reached far beyond legitimate companies. 2 days earlier, every local news station had reported that he had disappeared without explanation. Nobody knew where he had gone. Nobody expected a housekeeper from the Bronx to find him inside a forgotten warehouse. Her first thought was not about the man. It was about Noah. She hurried forward, gently placing herself between her son and the stranger before kneeling to wrap both hands around Noah's tiny shoulders. "Sweetheart, come here." Noah looked up at her with complete innocence. "Mommy, he is stuck." Grace swallowed hard. She forced herself to look at Lorenzo again. Despite the exhaustion visible across his face, his eyes remained remarkably steady, quietly studying both mother and child. There was no anger in them, only silent observation, as though he was measuring the kind of people standing before him. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. Every sensible decision pointed toward leaving immediately and calling emergency services from somewhere far away. Yet another fear quickly replaced the first. Whoever had left this man here could return at any moment. If she stayed, she could place Noah in danger. If she walked away, she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether she had abandoned someone who desperately needed help. Noah slowly reached into the pocket of his little jacket and pulled out the small juice box Grace had packed that morning. Without hesitation, he walked around her and held it toward Lorenzo with both hands. "You look thirsty." Grace instinctively reached to stop him, but Lorenzo quietly lowered his eyes toward the tiny offering instead of making any sudden movement. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then, in a voice rough from silence rather than anger, Lorenzo said, "Thank you, little man." Grace had expected arrogance. She had expected demands. Instead, she heard simple gratitude. Noah smiled proudly as though sharing his juice with a stranger was the most ordinary thing in the world. Watching her son, Grace felt something shift inside her. She had spent years teaching Noah that kindness should never depend on a person's appearance, wealth, or reputation. Now life had placed that lesson directly in front of her. She closed her eyes for one brief moment, took a slow breath, and realized that whatever happened next would change far more than a single Saturday afternoon. Grace slowly knelt beside the old wooden chair, careful to keep Noah close enough that she could reach him with one hand at any moment. Her fingers hovered over the heavy ropes without touching them. Every warning she had ever heard echoed inside her mind. Walk away. Protect your child. Do not become part of someone else's nightmare. Yet another voice spoke even louder. It was the quiet lesson her own father had repeated throughout her childhood before he passed away. Character is measured by how you treat people when helping them costs you something. She looked into Lorenzo's tired eyes again. "If I help you, I need you to promise me one thing," she said softly. "My son comes first." Lorenzo gave the slightest nod. "He already does." The answer surprised her. It carried no pride, no command, only calm certainty. Noah crouched beside the chair, studying the thick knots with complete fascination. "Mommy, we can untie him." Grace smiled sadly. "It is not that easy, sweetheart." Noah reached out and gently rested his tiny hand against Lorenzo's sleeve. "My teacher says when people are sad, we stay with them." Lorenzo lowered his eyes to the little hand. For years, executives, politicians, and wealthy investors had greeted him with carefully rehearsed smiles. Many admired his influence. Others feared it. Few ever touched him without expecting something in return. Yet this child, wearing faded sneakers with worn shoelaces and a jacket that had already been handed down twice, offered kindness without hesitation because he saw another human being instead of a reputation. Something inside Lorenzo quietly shifted. The silence surrounding them became strangely peaceful despite the uncertainty hanging over the warehouse. Grace noticed his breathing becoming steadier as Noah continued talking about the orange cat that had led him there, describing it with the endless enthusiasm only a 3-year-old could possess. Lorenzo actually found himself listening. Every word reminded him of a life untouched by ambition, rivalry, or suspicion. It was a world he could barely remember ever knowing. Grace finally examined the ropes more closely. Whoever had tied them had done so carefully enough that she could loosen them without causing additional discomfort if she worked patiently. She reached into her canvas cleaning bag, the same bag she carried to every apartment she serviced, and removed a small folding safety cutter she used for opening supply boxes. She hesitated one last time. "Noah," she whispered, "stand right beside me." The little boy obediently took her hand, while still holding his stuffed rabbit under one arm. Grace carefully began working through the thick rope, taking her time, making sure every movement remained controlled. Lorenzo watched her with quiet disbelief. "You know," he said after several moments, "most people would have walked away." Grace never looked up from her work. Maybe they would have. Another strand loosened. "But I cannot teach my son that compassion only belongs to easy situations." Noah beamed proudly, not fully understanding the conversation, but sensing that his mother had said something important. Lorenzo closed his eyes briefly. He had spent decades believing loyalty could be purchased, negotiated, or enforced. Yet standing before him was a woman who possessed almost nothing, choosing kindness over fear because that was simply who she was. For the first time in many years, Lorenzo wondered whether true strength had been quietly living in places he had never bothered to see. The final strands slipped free one by one until the heavy rope fell quietly onto the dusty concrete floor. Lorenzo remained seated for another moment, slowly stretching his stiff hands instead of standing immediately. Grace noticed the restraint. A different man might have rushed toward the nearest exit without a word of appreciation. Instead, Lorenzo looked first at Noah. "You shared your drink with me," he said gently. "That was very kind." Noah smiled as if kindness required no explanation. "Mommy says everybody gets thirsty." Grace lowered the safety cutter back into her canvas bag and helped Lorenzo carefully rise to his feet. Even standing, he carried himself with quiet confidence despite obvious exhaustion. The expensive suit he wore was dusty now, and without the polished surroundings that usually accompanied a man of his reputation, he appeared surprisingly ordinary. Grace almost found that thought harder to believe than everything else that had happened that morning. Before anyone could speak again, a distant metallic sound echoed somewhere beyond the warehouse walls. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but Lorenzo's expression changed instantly. His eyes shifted toward the entrance, alert yet controlled. Grace noticed the subtle change. "What is it?" she asked. Lorenzo listened for another second before answering. "Someone is nearby." Noah tilted his head. "Maybe it is the kitty." Lorenzo managed the smallest smile. "I hope you are right." Another sound followed, this time closer, followed by the creak of an old loading door moving somewhere outside the building. Grace's pulse quickened. She did not know who might be approaching, and she realized she did not want to find out while standing in the middle of an empty warehouse with her little boy. Lorenzo quietly scanned the room before pointing toward a narrow hallway leading deeper into the building. There should be another exit. Grace hesitated. Every decision seemed impossible now. Moments earlier, she had only wanted to bring Noah home for lunch. Now she was following a man whose face appeared on national news. Yet something about the calm way he spoke reassured her more than she expected. He was not issuing orders. He was trying to protect the only two people who had chosen to help him. Grace picked Noah up into her arms, and the little boy wrapped both arms around her neck while still clutching his stuffed rabbit. Lorenzo moved ahead at a careful pace, favoring one leg slightly, but refusing to complain. They crossed long stretches of empty concrete where abandoned machinery stood beneath layers of dust like forgotten monuments to another era. Sunlight streamed through broken skylights overhead, painting bright rectangles across the floor that shifted with passing clouds. Noah whispered, "This place is really big." Grace kissed the top of his head. "We are almost outside." Lorenzo paused beside an old service corridor and gently pushed open a weathered metal door. Fresh autumn air drifted inside. Beyond it stretched a narrow alley lined with overgrown weeds and cracked pavement leading toward quiet residential streets. Grace released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. Safety finally seemed close enough to touch. Then Lorenzo stopped before stepping outside. He turned toward Grace with a seriousness that carried no trace of authority, only gratitude. "You had every reason to leave me behind," he said. "Instead, you chose compassion. I will never forget that." Grace looked down at Noah, who had already fallen asleep against her shoulder after an exhausting morning. She answered with a tired smile. "I did not do it because of who you are. I did it because of who I want my son to become." Grace insisted they avoid the busy streets until they were farther away from the warehouse. Lorenzo agreed without argument, matching her steady pace through narrow side streets lined with aging brick buildings and small neighborhood stores preparing for the afternoon rush. Noah woke slowly in his mother's arms, rubbing his sleepy eyes before noticing Lorenzo walking beside them. "You are still here," he said with genuine excitement. Lorenzo smiled, a reaction that surprised even himself. "I am." Noah reached out his tiny hand without hesitation. After the briefest pause, Lorenzo accepted it. The contrast between the small fingers and the large hand that had signed billion-dollar agreements was impossible to ignore. Grace watched silently as the two walked together, wondering how quickly the impossible had become strangely ordinary. After nearly 20 minutes, they reached the modest apartment building where Grace rented a one-bedroom unit on the third floor. The paint around the entrance had faded years ago, and the old elevator had been out of service for months, forcing everyone to climb the narrow staircase. Grace apologized almost automatically. "It is not much." Lorenzo looked around at the worn hallway where children's drawings decorated apartment doors and neighbors greeted one another with quiet smiles. "It is a home," he replied. Grace unlocked the apartment and stepped inside. The space was small but spotless. Every surface reflected careful attention despite obvious financial hardship. A second-hand sofa stood beside a tiny bookshelf filled with children's picture books borrowed from the local library. The kitchen table had only 3 mismatched chairs, and colorful crayon drawings covered the refrigerator with magnets shaped like stars. Sunlight filtered through inexpensive curtains, filling the apartment with warmth that no luxury penthouse could imitate. Noah hurried to the kitchen, climbed onto one of the chairs, and proudly announced, "Mommy makes the best grilled cheese." Grace laughed softly for the first time that day. "Only because that is what we have." She opened the refrigerator and quietly counted the remaining groceries. Half a loaf of bread, a few slices of cheese, some apples, a carton of milk. Enough for lunch if they stretched everything carefully until payday. Lorenzo noticed the brief hesitation in her eyes before she reached for the ingredients. "Please," he said gently, "do not use your food for me." Grace shook her head while placing the skillet on the stove. "Guests eat first in this house." Noah nodded enthusiastically. "That is our rule." Lorenzo stood silently by the window overlooking the neighborhood playground. In his world, refrigerators overflowed with expensive ingredients that often went untouched. Here, every slice of bread mattered, every gallon of milk had been planned, every dollar carried responsibility. Yet there was no bitterness inside the apartment. Grace hummed quietly while preparing lunch, and Noah happily arranged paper napkins as though they were hosting a celebration instead of sharing a simple meal. When the sandwiches were finished, Noah immediately divided his own into 2 equal pieces before placing one onto Lorenzo's plate. "Sharing makes food taste better," he declared with complete confidence. Lorenzo looked down at the warm sandwich, then across the table at the mother who had so little, and the little boy who believed giving away half of everything was perfectly natural. He realized that he had attended state dinners, charity galas, and private banquets attended by the wealthiest people in America, yet none of those meals had ever humbled him the way this simple lunch quietly did. After lunch, Noah curled up on the sofa with his stuffed rabbit and drifted into a peaceful afternoon nap while cartoons played softly on the old television. Grace carefully folded the small blanket over him before returning to the kitchen to wash the few dishes they had used. Lorenzo stood quietly beside the window, watching neighborhood children ride bicycles along the sidewalk below. Their laughter echoed between the apartment buildings, simple and carefree, carrying a kind of freedom that money had never been able to purchase. "He is a remarkable little boy," Lorenzo said without turning around. Grace smiled gently as she dried the last plate with a faded kitchen towel. "He reminds me every day that the world is still worth believing in." Lorenzo looked toward the sleeping child. His father must have taught him well. The room grew still. Grace rested both hands on the edge of the sink before answering. "His father never had the chance." Lorenzo remained silent, sensing there was more behind those few words. Grace finally sat across from him at the small kitchen table. For the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to speak openly. Daniel worked as a city bus mechanic. He believed every person deserved respect no matter how much money they had. When Noah was only 6 months old, Daniel became seriously ill. Everything happened faster than anyone expected. Within a year, Noah and I were alone. She paused long enough to glance toward the living room where her son slept peacefully. The hospital bills took everything we had saved. I sold the car. I sold my wedding ring. Then I found work cleaning apartments because it was the first job that would let me earn enough to keep this place. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. Grace never spoke with bitterness. She simply described the facts of her life with quiet dignity. Some of the people whose homes I clean never learn my name, she continued. Some leave generous tips. Others barely look at me. None of that matters once I come home, because Noah greets me like I am the most important person in the world. Lorenzo lowered his eyes. During countless business meetings, he had evaluated success through numbers, influence, and negotiations. Sitting inside this tiny apartment, he realized he had never measured wealth the way Grace did. She counted blessings in bedtime stories, library books, packed lunches, and the sound of her son's laughter echoing through rooms that barely held enough furniture. Noah stirred slightly on the sofa before opening one sleepy eye. He smiled the moment he saw both adults still talking. "Mommy," he whispered, "is Mr. Lorenzo staying for dinner too?" Grace laughed softly. "We will see." Noah sat up, still wrapped in his blanket. "Everybody deserves another chance. Daddy used to say that." Grace looked at her son with surprise. "You remember that?" Noah nodded proudly. "You tell me every night." Lorenzo felt those simple words settle deep inside him. Another chance. He had spent years believing second chances belonged only to people powerful enough to seize them. Yet this little family offered them freely, expecting nothing in return. Looking around the apartment once more, Lorenzo quietly understood that the greatest lesson of his life had not come from boardrooms, expensive schools, or influential mentors. It had come from a widowed housekeeper and a little boy who still believed that kindness was stronger than fear. As the afternoon sun settled lower behind the neighboring apartment buildings, an unusual stillness drifted across the block. Lorenzo had been quietly watching the street through the living room window when he noticed 3 familiar black SUVs pull onto the curb below. They did not rush. They parked with careful precision, and several well-dressed men stepped onto the sidewalk, scanning every entrance with disciplined focus. Grace noticed the change in Lorenzo's expression immediately. "Do you know them?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "They work for me." Before either of them could say another word, a firm knock echoed through the apartment. Noah looked up from the floor where he had been building a tower from colorful plastic blocks. "Are we having more visitors?" Grace walked toward the door with understandable hesitation, while Lorenzo remained several steps behind her. She opened it only a few inches. Standing outside was a gray-haired gentleman in an immaculate navy suit accompanied by several respectful associates. The older man looked exhausted, but the moment his eyes landed on Lorenzo, visible relief replaced every trace of worry. "Sir," he said quietly, "we have been searching everywhere." Lorenzo gave a calm nod, but did not move toward the hallway. Instead, he glanced back at Grace and Noah before returning his attention to the visitors. The older man noticed the modest apartment, the sleeping blanket on the sofa, the children's books scattered across the coffee table, and finally the little boy who smiled and waved without the slightest fear. "These are the people who helped me," Lorenzo said. The sentence immediately changed the atmosphere. Every man in the hallway lowered his posture slightly, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Grace looked completely overwhelmed. She had expected questions, confusion, perhaps even suspicion. Instead, the distinguished gentleman stepped forward only after receiving a quiet nod from Lorenzo. "My name is Michael Bennett," he said warmly. "On behalf of everyone who cares about Mr. DeLuca, thank you." Grace shook her head. "We only did what anyone should do." Michael smiled with unmistakable sincerity. "I wish that were true." Noah tugged gently on Lorenzo's sleeve. "Your friends look worried." Lorenzo knelt so he could meet the little boy at eye level. "They were worried because they did not know where I was." Noah thought carefully before asking, "Are they nice?" Several of the men exchanged surprised glances, waiting to hear Lorenzo's answer. He smiled softly. "They are trying every day to become better people." Noah accepted the answer without hesitation and walked over to Michael, holding out one of his plastic building blocks. "You can have this one." The older gentleman blinked several times before carefully accepting the tiny blue block as though it were something priceless. A quiet laugh spread across the apartment, dissolving hours of tension in a single innocent moment. Lorenzo slowly stood and faced the group in the hallway. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. Grace Williams and Noah Williams are under my personal protection. They will always be treated with the same respect you would show me." The hallway became completely silent. No one questioned the statement. No one hesitated. Every person present understood that this was not simply an expression of gratitude. It was a promise. Grace looked at Lorenzo with disbelief, while Noah simply smiled, unaware that his small act of kindness had quietly changed the future of everyone standing inside that humble apartment. Lorenzo accepted Michael's offer to leave immediately, but before taking a single step toward the door, he turned back to Grace. "There is one thing I need to ask," he said. Grace looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What is it?" Lorenzo glanced around the modest apartment once more, taking in every detail he had overlooked for years whenever he thought about ordinary families. "Please allow me to repay your kindness." Grace smiled politely and shook her head almost before he finished speaking. "You already have." Lorenzo frowned slightly. "I do not think you understand." Grace folded her hands together. "I understand perfectly. You are grateful, and I appreciate that. But I did not help you because I expected anything in return." Michael carefully reached into his briefcase and placed a neatly prepared envelope on the kitchen table. "Please accept this. It will help with Noah's future." Grace did not even touch it. She gently slid the envelope back across the table. "If I accept money today, someday Noah might believe kindness has a price. I cannot teach him that lesson." The apartment became completely silent. Even the men standing in the hallway lowered their eyes. They had witnessed negotiations involving fortunes, international contracts, and complicated settlements, yet none of them had ever seen someone decline generosity with such calm dignity. Noah looked from one adult to another before climbing onto his chair. "Mommy," he asked innocently, "did we do something good?" Grace walked over and brushed a curl away from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart." Noah smiled proudly. "Then we already got our reward." Lorenzo slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment. Every word the little boy spoke seemed to uncover another truth he had ignored throughout his life. Success had taught him how to acquire almost anything. It had never taught him how to recognize people whose values could not be purchased. He opened his eyes again and carefully picked up the envelope himself. "Then I will respect your decision," he said quietly. Grace nodded with relief, believing the conversation had ended. But Lorenzo continued. "However, I also keep my promises." He turned toward Michael. "Beginning tomorrow, establish a scholarship in Daniel Williams's name for children whose parents work in service jobs. No publicity, no interviews, no connection to my companies. Make certain every family believes it came from neighbors who care." Michael smiled with genuine admiration. "It will be done." Grace stared at Lorenzo in surprise. "You do not have to do that," he answered with the same calm sincerity she had shown him all afternoon. "Perhaps I do." He looked toward the framed family photograph sitting beside the bookshelf, showing Grace, Daniel, and baby Noah smiling together years earlier. "Your husband believed every person deserved respect. I believe more children should grow up hearing his name." Grace's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but she remained composed. She simply whispered, "Thank you." Noah tugged gently on Lorenzo's sleeve one last time. "Will you come visit again?" Lorenzo smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. "If your mother says yes." Grace laughed softly. "You are welcome anytime, as long as you are willing to eat grilled cheese." A gentle wave of laughter spread through the room, and for a brief moment titles, wealth, and reputation disappeared. There was only a small apartment filled with ordinary warmth, where a powerful man discovered that the greatest honor he had received all year was not offered inside a boardroom or at a formal ceremony, but around a tiny kitchen table where kindness had quietly become the richest thing anyone could share. 1 year passed more quickly than any of them expected. Autumn returned with crisp air, golden leaves, and the familiar laughter of children filling neighborhood parks. Noah, now 4 years old, proudly walked through the front doors of his preschool carrying the same stuffed rabbit that had once accompanied him into an abandoned warehouse. To him, that extraordinary Saturday had become nothing more than a favorite memory about helping a tired stranger who needed a friend. Grace continued working as a housekeeper, leaving early each morning before sunrise and returning home each evening in time to read Noah his favorite bedtime stories. Her life remained simple, but something had quietly changed. People greeted her with greater warmth. New educational programs appeared throughout the city, giving working families opportunities they had never imagined possible. The Daniel Williams Scholarship had already helped dozens of children begin school with confidence instead of worry, yet no newspaper ever reported who had created it. Grace assumed kind neighbors and generous donors had come together to honor her late husband. She never searched for another explanation because gratitude mattered more to her than recognition. Across the city, Lorenzo DeLuca also changed in ways few people could fully understand. His schedule remained filled with meetings, responsibilities, and endless decisions, but those closest to him noticed something different. He listened longer before speaking. He visited community projects without photographers. He asked employees about their families and remembered the answers. Michael often smiled quietly because he knew exactly where the transformation had begun. One bright Saturday afternoon, Lorenzo kept a promise. Carrying nothing more expensive than a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery, he walked up the familiar staircase to Grace's apartment and knocked gently on the door. Noah answered before Grace could reach it. The little boy's face lit up instantly. "Mommy," Mr. Lorenzo came back. Grace welcomed him inside with the same kindness she had shown on the very first day. Lunch was once again grilled cheese sandwiches, apple slices, and warm conversation around the tiny kitchen table. There were no bodyguards inside the apartment, no formal speeches, and no discussion of influence or wealth. Noah proudly showed Lorenzo the books he had learned to read, the pictures he had drawn in school, and the tiny plant growing on the windowsill from a seed his class had planted together. Lorenzo listened with complete attention, celebrating every small accomplishment as though it were the most important news in the world. Before leaving, he noticed Noah carefully helping another little boy outside who had dropped his backpack on the sidewalk. The child did not recognize Lorenzo. He simply smiled, thanked Noah, and hurried home. Grace stood beside the window watching them. "He still believes everyone deserves another chance," she said softly. Lorenzo nodded. "So do I." As the evening sunlight filled the apartment with warm golden light, Lorenzo quietly realized that the greatest rescue of his life had never happened inside that abandoned warehouse. The ropes that had truly held him had been invisible, woven from pride, distance, and the mistaken belief that strength meant standing alone. A little boy had broken those bonds with nothing more than a juice box, a simple question, and a heart untouched by fear or prejudice. And on that ordinary autumn day, the world quietly remembered what dignity, compassion, and genuine humanity truly looked like.